So welcome to our next seminar during our 2021 virtual VSSA program. It's wonderful to have you here. And as you know, our Friday seminars are really focused on the MD-PhD path. So I am thrilled to start off the season or the session, the season with Dr. Megan Williams. She's the assistant director of the Vanderbilt MSTP program, and she directs admissions to the program. But today, her talk is going to be focused more on the motivation and the structures of MD PhD programs. And as you know, at the end of the summer, we're going to have a talk that's specific about admissions. So if you have admissions questions that kind of are relevant to the talk today, we would love to try to address those, but we might, depending on timing, might need to hold off a little bit and see if we have time at the end of the seminar today to address those. And if we don't get to them today, well, that's what the last session is all about. So thank you so much, Megan, Dr. Williams, for being here. We're thrilled to have you and can't wait to hear what you have to say.
I am Megan Williams, and I, as Beth mentioned, am the assistant director of the MD PhD program at Vanderbilt, or the MSTP. And I'm happy to answer questions throughout. I think Beth is going to help a bit with the chat if there are relevant questions, and then definitely happy, at the end, of course. So we're going to first start out with why would you even be interested in doing an MD PhD program? And why is this something you might be interested in pursuing? And the idea is that MD PhD graduates really are scientists. They are biomedical scientists, just like people that might get a straight PhD, and they end up using the power of research to help understand and cure human diseases. So that's kind of really the premise behind this. It's definitely someone who does a lot of research. And so I want to make that point clear. And as we go through, you're probably going to see a lot of combined elements of why you might want to do PhD or MD, and that of course makes sense. But one issue that often happens with people who do biomedical research is that there's sort of what we call this like bench to bedside abyss, where the bench is where you're doing your experiments, you're coming up with all these great ideas in the lab, and you're really thinking about how you're going to solve these exciting scientific problems and discoveries. And then over here, you've got patients in the clinic. And so there's these patients in the clinic that, are sick, that have different problems, and you just can't fix them. And so the idea is that sometimes in biomedical sciences, it's really difficult to take these discoveries that we make in the lab and translate them into being directly relevant to helping fix our patients. And so physician scientists are sort of meant to be here in a place where they work in this gap. They really have the knowledge on both sides. They've been trained as physicians and they've been trained as scientists, and they can use their clinical work to help inform their research. They are going to see patients in certain areas and they're going to say, gosh, this is so frustrating that we can't treat, this particular set of patients. And if we only knew the answer to a few of these questions, we might be able to treat them better. And then they can go back into their research lab and work on those types of areas that they're not able to satisfactorily treat their patients. One of the things, kind of a contrast with med school, is like a lot of MDs that only see patients might not have that same feeling where I'm sure they're frustrated they can't help their patients, but that doesn't always translate into their desire to go into the lab, to run a research lab, and to help find new cures for those patients. And that's something that physician scientists are really excited about doing. So we kind of say that they work in this intersection. And here's a Venn diagram that's supposed to represent the same thing. So they're really working kind of in this intersection between science and medicine. So we call MD, PhD graduates, or anyone really who sees patients but also does research, physician scientists. And so these are people who are trained as both physicians and scientific investigators. They typically do both of those things in their careers, and they'll split their lab time or their professional work time between lab research and patient care. Now, oftentimes this is more research focused than patient care. And part of the reason for that is that running a productive research lab requires a lot of time and commitment. It requires a lot of dedication to write grants, to get funding for your lab, to train your students and postdocs who work in the lab, and your undergraduate students like yourselves who are in the lab this summer. And so it requires a lot of dedication to that research side in order to have an active, productive research program. And so they'll often spend somewhere between 50 to 80% of their time doing research and focusing on that part of their career, and more like 20%, maybe a little bit more of their time on their clinical care. And that's a pretty common breakdown that you'll see across different institutions. So people that decide to pursue MD-PhD programs or physician scientists are really fascinated by the idea of human disease and biology, but they're also really creative and curious. They're scientists, so they have to be driven to answer these questions and to want to solve these problems. They also need a lot of persistence. As you may have heard or learned already, that research, is difficult, and it doesn't, always come easily, and there's a lot of failures. And so you've got to be willing to be excited enough about the research and what the potential of that research could be, to persist in seeing your projects to completion, and to get through those tough times when maybe your experiment didn't work or your data didn't turn out quite the way you want. Now you're not really sure what it means. And so that's something that we certainly look for and to see in physician scientists is persistence. And I'll go into a little bit more of what they do later, but kind of the types of places that physician scientists often work at are academic medical centers. So places like Vanderbilt, where you've got a medical school, hospital, perhaps an undergraduate campus, kind of all in one place. And there are opportunities to do research, to see patients, to maybe teach medical and graduate students, all kind of in that one location. They might also work at research institutes. So I think of these things as like um, maybe the National Institute of Health, which also is government, but it's a place where there's also a hospital and there's a clinical center and there's research. There are places like the CDC, Center for Disease Control, like different types of kind of government organizations that support research and medicine. And then there's also industry is also a place that some people go, and that's another option as well. The majority of them will work in academic medical centers, as we'll discuss later. So I know these next few slides have a lot of words on them, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some of the different ways to be a physician scientist. So I'm here to talk about MD PhD programs, so I'm probably a bit biased on that, but wanted to mention that there are other ways to get to this career and a little bit of the pros and cons of those different paths. Beth, was there a question?
Yes, so sorry. Thank you. It was relating to the last slide. How does an industry job differ if it comes to when it comes to clinical obligations, or does that not happen? Is it usually at these academic settings where people work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sorry, I was trying to go back and went forward. So oftentimes if you work for industry, to be honest, there probably aren't as many opportunities for a physician scientist to also do the clinical side. Because industry, working at Johnson and Johnson, there's probably not a hospital that Johnson and Johnson is affiliated with. And so a lot of the people that go into industry will transition full time to research, and that's a choice that they're making throughout their career. It's something that they're wanting to do. But sometimes they've maybe worked at a place like Vanderbilt for a lot of years, and they've gained a lot of really valuable experiences seeing patients and understanding some of the challenges and the problems with their clinical population. And so then they take that knowledge that they've gained, and they might then go become kind of in charge of a big corporation kind of someday. Or sometimes, probably more rare, but sometimes there are opportunities to be affiliated with a local hospital, and maybe still do a half day or a day a week of some clinic at a hospital while you also have your job in industry. That's something that's a little bit like kind of figure it out as you're on the job. And these aren't things that people do the second they graduate from the program. It's something that develops throughout your career as you sort of refine your interests and your goals and what that looks like for you. All right. So first I want to just talk a little bit about, and this, we get this question a lot, like, why do I need to do an MD PhD? Can't I just go to medical school and do research? And the answer is you can. It's not that there's only one way. There are multiple ways. We think there's one best way, but there are multiple ways to get to be a physician scientist. So if you were going to go to medical school, that would take you 4 years of medical school training, and then you would have to do fellowship and or residency and fellowship after that time, which is an additional usually 5 or 6 years of training. That's going to be mostly clinical training. But if you want to be a physician scientist, you're also going to include some research training in that time. So during medical school, if you choose this pathway, you might do additional research during medical school. Some programs, as you probably heard the other day, like Vanderbilt, do have options to do a few months of research, which is honestly not enough to be a physician scientist who runs their own productive research lab. But you could definitely be a great collaborator. You could do a lot of great clinical research with just maybe learning some skills during medical school. But then there's these other programs called year out programs, or we call one ours, it's called medical scholars, where you might do a full year of research, which would add an additional year to medical school. So now you're in medical school for 5 years. So that's something also to think about. It's not just 4 years at that point. So you do an additional year of research. And that can be a great opportunity to learn how to do research, and definitely to have a research project and get to explore that a little bit further. What you don't get with that is coursework or a really long dedicated time to focus on research. Then after that, you would join a research training program during residency or fellowship. And so this is where your residency and your fellowship kind of they're set up to cater to people who want to have research focused careers as physicians. And so they'll usually cut down clinical time just a little bit and allow additional time for you to do research. And that's a way to gain additional research. And that's great, I think. But again, you've only had, maybe a year of research training prior, and now you're trying to get maybe another year or two of research training, and you're also a resident and a fellow. And so you're really busy with a lot of your clinical duties as well. And there's a lot of demands on your time during that time. A really rare thing is that sometimes people who are in residency can get a PhD. We had actually one student that I know of at Vanderbilt, and I guess she wasn't really, well, she was a PhD student, but she was a resident who just got her PhD a couple of months ago. She was a surgery resident. And so that is a really cool experience, but that's rare. Like I said, I know of one while I've been here in 5 years who's done that. So I don't want you to think like that's the path, right? It is a path, but it's rare. And I think another important point here is people say, oh, I'm going to be so old if I get an MD and a PhD because I have to go to 2 degrees, school longer. But honestly, if you pursue the physician scientist path in both tracks, the first age that you might get your first major grant is really the same for people, whether they do an MD only or an MD PhD pathway. So this pathway can set you up for being a biomedical scientist, where you do a lot of training during the residency and fellowship years. You don't really do as much of that research training in med school. And then it can solidify you for these types of diverse careers where you might do research, you might see patients, you might teach in medical schools and graduate schools, maybe even a little undergrads at your institution. But one important fact in the bottom is only about 3% of MDs, so people that go to medical school, pursue this career path. And only about 1% of those ultimately end up having research labs that are funded by the National Institute of Health. So it is a very small percent of people. So that means that somewhere along the way, there are challenges. This is how I interpret this. There are probably challenges to pursuing the path this way that cause a lot of people to say, that's not what I'm interested in. And some are maybe, some med students aren't interested in this, and that's perfectly fine. This is a small amount of people who pursue a physician scientist career this way. I'm not going to spend quite as much time on this slide, but there's also, the option of just getting a PhD. And that's totally fine. You're then no longer, I would say, a physician scientist, you're just a scientist. But some people kind of decide, I really like research, but I don't know that I need to be in the clinic and I need to be seeing patients. I don't think that that's going to be an important part of my professional career. And so I think for now, I'm just going to get a PhD, and that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to again look at kind of the numbers of people who are biomedical science PhDs who pursue this pathway. It's only about 22% of people who get PhDs in biomedical sciences who end up having these active funded research labs, where only about 18% of them are actually funded by the NIH. And the reason I bring that up is that, again, people might think, well, that's the best pathway to be a scientist. And it's certainly a great pathway. And the reason that only 22% of people are doing that is that a lot of them discover other things that they enjoy and are passionate about, as I'm sure you learned from Beth on Monday. It's like Beth and I that are, we have biomedical science PhDs, but are not doing research, but we love what we do. So that's totally fine. Not a problem at all. And then I'm going to talk about MD-PhD. Is there a question that's relevant, Beth?
Yes, yeah, sorry. Yeah, about the previous stats, that was fascinating, the 1% and 3%. So there was a question. Um, Perfect, thank you. So it says 1% stay in NIH R01 funded status. Is that 1% of that 3%, or is that of overall?
That's a great question. I actually don't know that. I did not get this data. I took it from someone else. So I probably need to ask that question. I would
Tiny
say either
fraction.
way, it's a small amount of
It's a
people.
small number.
Whether if it's 1% of 3%, it's really small. If it's only 1% total, it's still pretty small.
Still small. Perfect. Thank you,
I
ma'am.
will, that is a good thing though. I should probably find that out. All right. So then the next option is to talk about MD PhD training. So in MD PhD training, it typically takes about 8 years in your program. Can maybe take a little bit less, like 7, but it's going to be about 8 years to complete both degrees. And then after that, you're going to usually spend about 5 years in residency and fellowship. I don't think the amount you make is super crucial here, but they are financially supported during that time, which is helpful. So you will spend additional time in residency and fellowship gaining additional research. We integrate your medical and research training, so you're not, you're kind of sometimes getting some dual credit for some of the different types of things that you do between the 2 degrees, so it doesn't take as long as it would to complete them both individually. And then your people, a lot of times in these programs, you have a lot of people in your MD PhD training program whose job it is to prepare you to be a physician scientist. That's, the point of these programs. And so you're getting optimized training to be a physician scientist that's going to talk about how to navigate challenges, what this career can look like, guide you really specifically into the types of residency programs that would be best for you. And so it's really more streamlined and optimal. Another really great part that I think can't be emphasized enough is that the PhD isn't just time to do research, but the PhD really focuses on training you how to be a researcher. The courses that you take are not the same as courses in undergrad or medical school, where it's really content focused, but are a lot more focused on training you how to think critically, how to set up and design experiments, how to interpret your results, and how to write grants, all of those types of things that you're going to need to do as a scientist. And if you take the other pathways, you don't really have a defined, dedicated time, if you do MD only, to learn all of the grant writing and how to think like a scientist. You might do a project, but you don't have a thesis committee that's going to dissect your project and help you think about how to think about it. And those types of training that you're going to experience is super valuable. You also have 3 or 4 years, usually more like 4 years in the MD PhD program, where really your primary and almost only commitment is to do research and to learn how to be a scientist. You don't have demands on your time to also be a resident and see patients in the clinic and try to work it in. It's really protected time to learn to be a researcher, and we think that's extremely valuable. About 80% of graduates of MD PhD programs nationally pursue the path of being a physician scientist and stay on that track. So that's the highest percentage of the 3 options that we've talked about. And then they also have a higher percent of being funded by the NIH, and about 50% of our graduates, or more than 50%, do 50% of research, or 50% of their time doing research. And that's kind of complicated to think about, but it means that they do a lot of research, is really the idea here. Is you're not, most graduates are spending, more than half of their time doing research. So if you've decided that you think you're interested in MD PhD programs, we're going to talk a little bit more about what those look like and where they might be. So about 100 medical schools in the US will have combined MD PhD programs. But you might also hear some programs be referred to as MSTPs, or medical scientist training programs. So I wanted to just mention what that means. So programs that are MSTPs, or medical scientist training programs, like Vanderbilt's program, have a grant from the National Institute of Health that helps support our program. It doesn't pay for all of our program. It really only pays for about 20 to 25%. The rest of the money comes from Vanderbilt endowments and institutional money that the dean of the School of Medicine has said is important and crucial to train our physician scientists. So those programs, those 50 programs roughly that have those grants, are called MSTPs. So I like to think of it that all of these programs are MD PhD programs, but not all MD PhD programs are MSTPs. If you're a student, there's probably not a lot of difference in what that looks like to you. MSTPs are often larger because they have more funding, and so they're often bigger than the MD PhD programs. They might have more like mechanisms in place to ensure they're adequately training their students, because every 5 years they have to get their grant renewed from the NIH. But it's doesn't mean that the other programs that are MD PhD programs only are not great training programs as well. So I don't want to give that impression. Most MD PhD programs will provide tuition waivers and stipends for both medical school and graduate school phases. So we are supporting your time in the program so that you can focus on being on your training. And then most of them will also integrate the training between the two programs. So it takes about 7 to 8 years to complete these degrees versus the 9 or 10 that it might take if you were going to do each degree separately. And this map here is actually a map of the 50 or so programs that are MSTPs. So they're definitely across the country, less of them in the middle of the country, but there's quite a few around the US. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how these programs integrate this training. So this is sort of kind of the way that they might be set up. So the first 2 years are usually medical school. And as you might have learned, the first 2 years of medical school normally at most institutions are often what we just call pre-medical coursework or preclinical coursework, where you're really in the classroom learning everything you need to know about medicine in order to go into your clinical rotations. And oftentimes it's divided into normal physiology. So a lot of times the first year of medical school, you'll learn how the body normally functions. And then in the second year, you'll learn what happens, when things go wrong, what happens when you have certain diseases, and what can we do about that, or abnormal physiology. That's kind of how often the first 2 years of medical school are. But in an MD PhD program, after that time, you'd then pause and you'd go to your graduate research, which we put years 3 to 6, which is 4 years. So that usually takes about 4 years in an MD PhD program to complete that PhD. Now that is less than you might have heard that the PhD program takes. And part of the reason for that is that often your lab rotations are completed in various times throughout your first 2 years of medical school. And then you often have a little bit of credit that you might get for some of your medical coursework for graduate school, because you're going to learn a little bit about biochemistry and genetics and neuroscience and some different areas of medicine that are very similar to the coursework that you might take in some introductory graduate school courses. So you'll still take some graduate school coursework, but you won't take as much because you're going to get some dual credit from some of your medical school coursework. So usually your first year of graduate school will be a mix of coursework and research. And then your next 3 years, so years 4, 5, and 6 in an MD PhD program, are typically mostly focused on research time. Then after you finish your PhD, and there's no set time, some people finish sooner and some people take an extra year, and some are speed demons and finish in 3 years, and that's totally fine. So whenever you finish and your committee and your PI decide that you are ready to defend your dissertation, you'll then return to medical school, where you'll do about usually 2 more years, where one of those years is called your rotations or your clerkship, where you rotate through a bunch of different areas of medicine. Those areas include pediatrics, OB-GYN, internal medicine, surgery, and I think there's one more that I'm missing. But that's okay. So neurology and psychiatry, that's the other main one that you do. And those ones everyone does. And then there's some time usually to take a little bit of electives. And that year is really made to decide, what do I want to do? What area of medicine is my favorite? And then usually in your final year, you'll take electives that are specific to your interests, a little bit more defined in the areas that you're most interested in. This is what a lot of programs look like. Now, over the last few years, a lot of programs have also been changing and modifying their curriculum. So some of them do only a year and a half of coursework, and then you start your rotation sooner. Vanderbilt's curriculum is a little different. If anyone attended the talk yesterday about medical school, you probably learned about Vanderbilt's medical school curriculum. What we've actually done is combine the normal and abnormal coursework, the preclinical coursework that's normally 2 years, into just 1 year. We did not just take 2 years of content and like shove that all into 1 year, because that would be very difficult and a lot to learn. But we really cut down the pieces of medical knowledge that we think are foundational for that first year, and then some of the details you might pick up later on in additional coursework. It is 13 months long. So when I say a year, they start in July and they end the following July. You might think of a year of school to be August through May. And that's not quite what it looks like here at Vanderbilt. So that's just something to think about as well. There's an extra couple of months added onto there. And they have a very dynamic curriculum that consists of lecture, consists of small group case-based learning, a lot of different styles. It's not just lecture. You've got some afternoons off to study on your own. It's a really exciting kind of curriculum. And then in your second year, you now get to move on to your clinical clerkships, which is normally the third year, which, if you remember from the previous slide, MD PhD graduates aren't doing that until year 7 of an MD PhD program after their PhD. At Vanderbilt, you get to do that in your second year. And so you don't have to wait 6 years before you're really getting this clinical time where you're learning how to be a doctor and being exposed to patients. So that's going to be your clerkships, all those different rotations in medicine I talked about. And then you'll do your graduate research. That looks very similar. Not a lot there has changed. We do have this continuity clinic, because you might think, well, gosh, I learned all these exciting things in medical school, and now I'm going to spend 4 years in graduate school. Aren't I going to just forget them all? And our goal is that you won't exactly forget them. They might get a little rusty, but through this clinic, about once a month, you'll go back into the clinic to help refresh your clinical skills. And this can be something that you get to actually decide which area you want to spend this time. It could be that you're interested in neurology, and so you're going to see a neurologist the whole time. You're going to work with a neurologist, get to know them really well, gain a lot of experience in that area. Or maybe you're kind of debating between neurology and psychiatry because you're really interested in the brain, but you just aren't quite sure yet which of those two areas you want to go into. So you might be able to spend 6 months with a neurologist and then another 6 months with a psychiatrist. And now you've decided psychiatry, that's what I want to do. And so you're going to spend the rest of your time with a psychiatrist in that clinic. And that's really made to, like I said, grow your clinical skills, help keep them fresh, so that when you return to medical school after your PhD, you can transition pretty easily. So you'll just have 1 year of clinical training, 1 year of where you'll take elective courses that are kind of specific to the interests that you have. And so one of our students wrote this on here and said it's basically you're being a doctor again. So you got to learn how here, and now you get to do it again more in depth in this final year. And as you can see, there's only 3 years of medical school here. So it has the ability to finish in 7 years. How can we do that? How can we give you basically cut down a whole year of medical school? So at Vanderbilt, the medical students do research. And if you've got a PhD already, you probably don't need to spend a couple of extra months doing research in medical school. And so we are able to give our MD PhD students some credit for that research time that the medical students do. And then throughout this continuity clinic, you also gain some hours as well that can help count towards medical school. So one thing I wanted to just mention are kind of the types of options available for PhD programs. This is what Vanderbilt has available. I think any program is going to have a lot of these like basic biomedical science PhD programs. So something like biochemistry or cancer biology or neuroscience, you're going to find those at most MD PhD programs. If you get into some programs that we kind of call non-traditional, which might include engineering, like we have biomedical engineering and mechanical engineering, or biomedical informatics, or things more in public health like epidemiology and health policy. Those types of programs might not be available at all institutions. So if you're interested in some of those like maybe less traditional options, you'll definitely want to ensure that all the schools you're applying to have those types of options. There are even some programs, and unfortunately Vanderbilt is not one of these, but that will have some social sciences and humanities options. So sometimes there's sociology, anthropology, some other choices as well. And so those are other ones where you're going to want to really check and make sure that those are options at a program that you're interested in. So I starred the ones that I thought were kind of less traditional. And then there's a few like that I mentioned here are new. I think that's great because we are always trying to identify options at Vanderbilt where we can partner with a PhD program that might be really interesting to our students. So health policy is actually a brand new PhD program. Their first class just started last fall, so they're kind of just finishing their first year, and so we're joining with them. And mechanical engineering is certainly not a new program to Vanderbilt, but is a program that is newer to the MSTP because they have a lot of labs working on devices that are really important and crucial for surgery and medicine. And we had some students interested in those labs. And so we realized that that was a program that we should partner with as well, because there was a lot of interest from our students in some of the labs in that area. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about mostly the Vanderbilt MSTP. So I wanted to just kind of throw kind of our mission statement here so that you can see what we're trying to do. And so our goal of our program is to identify, mentor, and foster the careers of a diverse workforce of superior future leaders. And that's something important. We do focus on that leadership aspect in academic medicine, who are dedicated to improving human health through research, clinical activities, and leadership. And so those are really the types of things that we're hoping to train our students for, and also how we look to recruit students who are going to come into our program. A lot of programs are going to have things that they do to train their students. And these lists are going to have different names and look different and be different across programs. But as you're looking at MD PhD programs, you should kind of realize that they're all going to have stuff that they do. They're going to have workshops and courses and special kind of events that happen. And those are important things for you to find out about, because that's how the program thinks it's important to train their students. That's what they focus on. And that might match with what you're interested in, or you might be best supported by those things, or maybe that's not matching with your interests and you want something else out of a program. And so those are things to think about. On this page, I've listed things that sort of everyone does. I'm not going to go over all of these necessarily, but these are kind of required aspects of the program. These courses called Foundations of Biomedical Research are in your first year of your program, first and second year while you're in medical school. We're actually going to teach you a few things that we think are really important for grad school. So we're going to help you learn a little bit about grant writing and rigor and reproducibility in science and responsible conduct of research, and a few things that you need to do in order to best prepare for your grad program that you might kind of miss by missing out on a little bit of coursework that the first year PhD students might take. We also have a seminar series that runs throughout the entire time in our program. And I think this is really special because every Wednesday during the academic year, all of our students are required to go to our seminar. So we have students across all years coming together on Wednesdays at noon. And I think that's really special that they're all seeing each other every week. And I've heard one program had some event and they were like, this is one of our 3 times a year our whole program comes together. And for us, that happens every single week. And I think that's super exciting that we have that opportunity. We do take a bit of a break in the summer, um, but it's great to have that. I mentioned this clinical preceptorship program. One other thing I want to mention is our leadership workshops. So when we say we want to train leaders, we don't just say we're going to train leaders and expect you to be leaders, but we actually focus on providing you with some actual content to develop your leadership skills. And those can be done through 2 leadership workshops that you have to take, where we bring in experts that aren't necessarily physicians and scientists, but are people who are in our College of Education and Human Development, who actually do research, and their work is on teamwork and group dynamics and navigating those types of things. And so we bring in experts to help you learn valuable skills that will be important for your leadership in the future. We also give you opportunities to lead. So all of these things that I'm showing on this slide and that will be on the next slide are planned and organized by students. Of course, we have advising from our team, but students, committees of students plan all of these activities in order to gain leadership skills, to be chairs of committees, committee members, and help develop their leadership skills in that way as well. I'm just going to also mention the advising colleges. I think I bring that up later, but these advising colleges, and I'm sure if you attended yesterday, Jen Kimball talked about them, but they are really things within the medical school and the MSTP to help provide sources of support, but they also have a lot of social aspects to them as well. And I like to think of them as like Harry Potter houses. I think it's very similar. They have colors and like I was gonna say shields, I don't know if that's right, logos. They have animals associated with them, at least in the men's school. The MSTP ones aren't quite that exciting. We just named them after scientists. But they are places where you can be broken up into 4 of these. So if there's 100 people in your incoming med school class, or there's 100 or so MSTP students total, only a quarter of them are in your college. And so you get to know that group a lot better. And you also have advisors affiliated with that college. And so those advisors are people you can go to who aren't meant to write you recommendation letters or to grade you, but they're really meant to help you through your career. And this is a huge source of support that we have for our students. These are sort of some things that are more like optional in terms of choosing to participate in these things. But this is a whole host of events that we have that really are made to further train our students, or have them be involved in things they're passionate about. And I'm not going to go through all of these. I am going to just talk about a mini MSTP because that's what I've got shown here. This is something that was started by students about 12 years ago. And what we do on our mini MSTP days is we bring about 80 middle school students to campus. And then we have 2 of those days. So it really ends up being about 160 students in 5th and 6th grade that come to Vanderbilt for a day and get to participate in a bunch of scientific experiments and learn about MDPhD. One of the schools is from Dixon County Schools, which is kind of a more rural area, about an hour outside of Nashville. And then the other school is called Lead Academy, which is more of a kind of in Nashville school that's got students from kind of an under-resourced area. And so this is them. I think they're extracting DNA from strawberries here and they're having a great time. We were able to do this virtually as well this year through Zoom. We delivered little kits to all the schools so that we could do this experiment and talk to them virtually, which went really well. But we got this piece of feedback here, and I don't know if you can read that, but on the top of their piece of paper that they had to do, that someone wrote, "I have the best day ever." So I think that's really exciting when we get that type of feedback from these students. So that's something that was developed by our students and has been going on for like 12 years now. But we do a lot of other things. We bring in physician scientist speakers a couple of times a year and have a career talk from them, as well as a scientific seminar. We have a data club that we'll actually do in the summers, where our students talk a bit about their pathway. And we have a lot of different committees and things that you can be involved in as a student at Vanderbilt. So a couple of other things, we provide a lot of support for our students. One aspect of that is going to be financial support. So as I mentioned earlier, you have tuition fees, stipend, and health insurance. We do accept international students and they will receive the same funding as well. And that's kind of guaranteed throughout your time in the program. So there's no worry that you didn't get a fellowship or get a grant or something like that. We have, like I mentioned, a ton of professional and career development experiences to help you develop yourself as a physician scientist. And then we also have a lot of mentorship. And in these advising colleges that I talked about, you're going to have peer to peer mentoring. So you're going to actually have what we call a big sibling who's in the class above you. And your big sibling actually will have a big sibling who will have a big, and we call those families, where you'll kind of have this mentoring family that runs throughout the entire program that you can use to go to for support. And you'll have faculty mentors. And then we've also added these resident mentors. So these are people who are going to be physician scientists as well, but are still only in residency or fellowship. And so they're kind of in the more recent stages to you than maybe a faculty member who was maybe 30 years ago, in that stage. And so these PSTP residents can be really great resources to help you learn how to, navigate the next steps or challenges you might be facing in your program. We also have a robust leadership team, which I'm going to show you on the next slide, that's really there to support you. I show this picture because we're in Eskin Biomedical Library, which is right next to Light Hall if you're on campus this summer. And this lounge area outside of our offices is oftentimes populated by students. We're kind of getting back to this phase from not being here much during COVID. But I just took this picture one day. There wasn't like anything special going on. It was just a random day outside my office. Over here on this side would be like where my office door would be. And in this lounge area, we have a bunch of our students just studying, chatting with each other, spending time together. And I think that's really great. And these are all students in different areas. This guy was an M4 at the time. This person was actually studying for one of his step exams. I believe these two were one of the big little kind of mentorship pairs. And they're all just, hanging out, talking. And that's what we really value, is this sense of community in our program. And we think that's super important. These are just the members of our team, and I don't think I'm going to go over this just to save some time for questions. But the reason I show this slide is that we have a robust team. We have 8 people, 4 of whom are scientists and physician scientists who are here to help you with kind of the graduate and medical training aspects of the program. And then 4 other people who help with more of the administrative aspects, who are more like full-time kind of MD-PhD type employees or program employees, whereas these people are balancing their own research and clinical duties as well. And so we really want you to understand that there's a lot of support here. There's a lot of people that you can go to as you have questions and need help. And I think that's an important part of a program, and something that students maybe don't even think about when they're applying, but that our students talk about being really important when they're in the program. So as you're interviewing for these programs, who are the people that work for the program? How available are they? Are they going to really be there to help and support you? And I think that's something that you definitely want to consider as you're considering MD-PhD training. So what do alumni do? This is alumni of all programs. So this isn't a Vanderbilt specific slide. This is alumni across the country. So you've been in a program, you've graduated with both degrees. About 95%, so most of our graduates, and this can vary from year to year, but pursue residency training. If you want to be a physician scientist and you want to be a physician, you want to see patients, you have to go to residency, right? You have to get more clinical training. So that is usually about 3 to 7 years, depending on what you go into. If you do surgery, it's on the longer end. If you do internal medicine, which would be like hematology, oncology, endocrinology, gastroenterology, some of these different areas, that is only 3 years of residency, but then you'll often follow it with a couple of years of fellowship training. And a lot of fellowship training that our students pursue will have a lot of research training as well, because as we mentioned earlier, you still, beyond the PhD, want to keep up your research training skills. And that time that you spend in residency and fellowship doing research is sort of equivalent to the postdoc that you might do if you got just a PhD and then went to postdoc training. So that is sort of an equivalent experience. So you might be thinking, well, how do PhDs have to do postdocs, but MD PhDs don't? And that's kind of how that fits in. I already mentioned this stat, but approximately 50% of our national graduates will be doing more than 50% of their professional time doing research. And the reason we point that out is these careers are really meant to be research careers. And if you're not excited about research, then you should not do an MD PhD program. Then you should go to medical school. And we'd say many of our graduates end up filling what we call academic leadership roles. So that means they're deans of medical schools, presidents of medical centers, directors of MD PhD programs, department chairs. There are people who are in charge of things at these academic medical centers like Vanderbilt. I mentioned before kind of some of these alternate career options. I think this is a lot of them. I didn't have these public policy, public health. Those are some other options that weren't on my career before. And then we did a survey of our MD PhD graduates across the country, so all of them, not just one school, and asked them to, this is how we get this data, what are you doing? But also, would you choose to do this again, was kind of the question that we asked them. And more than 80% of them said that they probably would or definitely would choose to pursue an MD PhD career again. And so we think that's pretty exciting. I mean, if 80% of your graduates said that they enjoy what they're doing and they would choose this pathway again, I think that means that they definitely are doing the right thing and it's something special. This is sort of that graph, or what I talked about on the last slide, but more in graph form. So about 68% of graduates across the country are in academia. 14% are in private practice. For the most part, we don't get too excited about MD PhD graduates in private practice because a lot of them are not engaged in research. So they're not using necessarily their skills that we've trained them to do. But sometimes a few of them can be creative and can be engaged in a little bit of research, especially through collaborations. And then, as we mentioned, these institutes, industry, and some other areas that they might pursue. This is the kind of research that they do. And you'll notice if you add all these up, this does not equal 100%. It's much more than that. And that's because the graduates often do more than one kind of research. You might be doing research that is kind of basic science, but also you think it's really translational. You might be doing some clinical related research as well as your translational or basic science research. You might be doing more public health related research as well. So this is kind of what this breakdown looks like of the types of research that graduates do. But as you can see, basic and translational research are definitely the most common types because these, like we said, we're biomedical scientists, and that's mostly what types of research they might pursue. These are the graduates from the MD PhD program at Vanderbilt. I just put 2 years, but to show you that you can pursue a lot of different specialties after you're done. So you'll see, internal medicine and neurology, pediatrics are pretty common because those careers allow you to spend a lot of time in research. When you're a surgeon, or some of the what we might call like surgery subspecialties, which might include things like ophthalmology or like OB-GYN, things that you have to do a little more technical skills with your hands. Those types of programs require a little bit more like clinical time. So you might have to spend more time doing kind of like keeping up your skills, actually doing surgeries, but you also might have to then see your patients in the clinic after. And so they are not as easy to do the MD PhD degree because you have to spend more clinical time and don't always have as much time for research, but it's not impossible. And so you'll see that our graduates do a lot of things, but more focused in certain areas than others sometimes. And then if you look at where they're going, these programs are across the country. They're not just staying in the Southeast. They're not all going to Vanderbilt after. They're going to the West Coast. They're going to, Harvard affiliated residency programs. They're going to a lot of really great programs. Something our director likes to say here is it's not about, where we want you to go. We don't look at, it's not about looking at a list and saying, oh, look at how great their match was. Of course, we get excited about that, but it's about where you want to go. Are you going to the top choice? Are you going to the place that you want to go at the end of training? And that's what's really important here. I think I'm going to skip this slide. It's really a rehash of what our graduates are doing. It's pretty similar to across the country, not a lot different. So I'm going to skip that to make sure we have time for questions. I want to just go over this slide really quickly. And I talked about data club. So every Wednesday in the summer, in June and July, we have a data club. We also call it data ideas and beverages because it used to be like in the afternoon. But basically, data club is Wednesdays at noon. So it will interfere with virtual VSSA, the MD track, but it's currently available on Zoom. So if any of you are interested in attending this, you can just let me know. You can email me at this email that's listed here, mdphd@vanderbilt.edu. And I can send you the link every week for our data club that we have Wednesdays at noon, if that's something you're interested in. And we aren't recording these. We just haven't been recording them, no specific reason. So it's not something available via recordings, but if you wanted to attend and weren't too interested in attending the virtual VSSA that day, you certainly could. So just let me know. And then also Tuesday, June 29th, I believe, I got that date right, at 5:30, we're going to host an MSTP student meet and greet through VSSA. So if you're on campus at Vanderbilt this summer and this is something you're interested in, we're going to have small groups of students available to chat, answer questions, and let you find out whatever it is you might want to know about them. And Beth will definitely send out more information to the people on campus. And then this is my contact information. So if you are on campus, I'd love to meet you in person if you're interested in MD PhD programs. If you are virtual, I'm happy to schedule a Zoom meeting if you have additional questions about these programs or anything that we can help with. And as Beth mentioned, we'll be doing more of the admission side of things later in the summer. And then we also have a newsletter. It's on our website. There's a link to sign up for it. And it is only once a month, so it's not a huge amount of spam or anything like that. But I think it's a really great insight into what students in our program are doing. We have a lot of student life, we have a lot of program updates, and it's just a great way to see what kind of the life of a student might look like and hear about updates from our program. And then all the articles in the newsletter are also posted on our blog on our website. But that's a great way to just learn more about MD PhD training as well. And then there's this generic website from the AAMC that has a ton of information, and that's updated periodically about pursuing MD PhD programs as well. We have Facebook and Twitter, and we're also getting an Instagram soon. So follow us on social media. We definitely post a lot more on Twitter than Facebook, and hopefully our Instagram will be active once we get that up and running. So these are just ways to keep up with our program if you're interested in. And we thank you for coming, everyone. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you again at the end of the summer. And you'll hear from our students and faculty throughout the next couple of weeks as well, which will be really valuable. So thank you, everyone.
Check out our website to find recordings of all of our videos. We'll get them posted about a week after each of the presentations. We can't wait to see you.